Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we've got another unscripted movie review, this time of the newest film from Alex Garland called Annihilation. So here's something you might not know. My background, it's not really completely in music or film criticism or theory. It's a lot more in science. My bachelor's degree was in physics, I minored in economics, and now I'm reviewing things on YouTube. Typical. But my point with that is, given some of my knowledge base of the terminology or the experimental method, or how a lot of that is operated upon both in the field and in the laboratory, I have a bit of a complicated relationship with hard sci-fi. Especially the sort of hard sci-fi that wants to ground itself in more of a real-world setting. Now, that's not saying these movies can't work. I really liked a lot of those philosophical questions that Alex Garland raised with his last film, Ex Machina, but at the same time, when you start hearing about this film, Annihilation, even though I don't really have a huge amount of backdrop in biology, and you start hearing some of the interesting things they're doing with biology and science, immediately my eyebrows go up and I had to wonder how much suspension of disbelief would be required for this, even if a large chunk of it would be justified by saying, look, it's aliens, just go with it. But walking into Annihilation, I think there's going to be a few different audiences who will be stepping into this movie. You're going to see those who are going in for more of an action movie, a set of women on a mission movie that might have a bit of a backdrop in hard sci-fi, but they're looking more for the action. Then you're going to have the group of people who have read the reviews and realized the most frequent reference is to Andrei Tarkovsky and some of his scientific related films like Solaris, where the films are less about the scientific jargon, less about the action for damn sure, and more focused on the tone and philosophy and the bigger ideas surrounding the science at the very core of it. And I want to establish this right out of the gate because there have been people who have been making some broad-based comparisons that seem a tad misconstrued surrounding Annihilation, if only to seem like they want to make it sound more interesting, and they're not really grasping the central ideas at its core. Like, there was one article I saw about trying to compare how Annihilation is the sort of movie that would show Pokemon in real life is just a bad idea, and I don't know if it was possible to miss the central theme harder. It just did not connect at all. But at the same time, I can see a lot of people walking into this movie and then coming out of it thinking, well, that wasn't all that fun. And I would say it's not really a criticism that I'm going to make, but if anything, I think the criticisms I'm making are going to be wildly different than many of those that are currently being examined by a lot of critics. Because yes, this is a good movie. It's a gorgeous looking movie, but there are problems with it, and both in terms of like the film structure and some of the tones and science that it's trying to integrate that the more I think about it, it might work in terms of archetype and metaphor and theme until it starts to fall apart at the seams kind of around the edges. So alright, what is this movie about? Well, it's starring Natalie Portman as a soldier turned biologist who is reeling over the past year where her husband has gone on to a military mission into a weird little area in the southern side of Georgia called the Shimmer. Now this area, from what can be seen from the outside, is completely walled off from radio signals. It's not something where anything can be properly determined or unscrambled, and every team that's gone in has not come out. This time, however, somebody does. Her husband, Oscar Isaac, after a year, does come out of the Shimmer, but something's off about him, and his biology starts breaking down, so it starts seeming a little bit weird. So it becomes, at first glimpse, a woman on a mission movie. You get several characters under the control of one main lead scientist who you can already tell falls into a couple different action cliches about how that hard-bitten leader might operate. And then you have the supporting cast, and in particular I want to call out Tessa Thompson and Gina Rodriguez, who really step it up when dealing with some pretty complicated emotional dynamics that lie at the core of this film. And that's the first thing that I want to stress here, because this is not an action movie. If anything, it plays closer to the more cold, clinical, hard sci-fi that is looking to draw you in with the grand vistas and trying to get you to think about the ideas at its core. And I will say this, Natalie Portman, for the performance that she is required to give and the layers that she's supposed to be trying to hold together, even as you can tell that parts of her character are slightly more archetype than they probably should be, but at the same time, she does a really good job with that specific role. And it's kind of nice to see her in this sort of brand of R-rated sci-fi where things do get a little bloody, do get pretty nasty around certain edges. And that's the other thing. Even though if you see sort of things where people go into a random jungle or swampy area and face monsters within, some of you might be coming in with the expectation that this might fall in the lines of more of a B-movie premise. But that's not really what Alex Garland is doing. He's certainly not shooting it like that. This is pretty about the furthest thing you can get from exploitation. And that will, one thing mean, is that it's not nearly as fun as a lot of people would otherwise expect. It's shot very coldly and clinically. It might use a slightly more saturated palette, but the camera is a lot stiffer. It's not trying to emphasize the action. On the one hand, once you clue into that mindset, once you clue into that way of thinking, you can appreciate some of these shots for as beautiful and colorful as they are, and some of the metaphors that they are trying to sell with a lot of this imagery, especially with the usage of color, and especially when they get to the central nexus point of it all at the very end of the third act. But at the same time, there are tonal whiplash issues. When you start realizing, even from the very beginning, it might be set up as something more of a woman on a mission movie, but by the time you get to the third act, it shifted very much into a dialogue restrained piece that is trying to aim for a little bit more of the tone poem side of things, speaking more with metaphor and visual symbolism and visual language other than actual dialogue. And on some level, if you start trying to think around the science, I can see any biologist in the audience losing their minds, especially when they start referencing what is happening to the DNA within the shimmer. And you know what, that didn't bother me on some level, because a lot of that, again, it's more tone, it's more trying to cultivate that atmosphere, and they use a lot of subtitles to do so, which I don't think was the smartest idea. It actually makes a lot of this film feel pretty chunky and distorted. But at the same time, I think the transition could have been pulled off a little bit better, especially surrounding that lead character who takes off on her own, because of course she does at one point. But let's talk a little bit about the emotional dynamic and the themes surrounding this movie, because it's called Annihilation, but in reality, a lot more of it is focused less on that particular idea of all-consuming destruction as it is self-destruction. Makes it very clear very early on that a lot of our female characters entering into the shimmer, they've got something of a death wish from some sort of personal drama and strife in their past, some existential angst that is holding them down, and that ultimately means that a lot of them have reconciled with the fact that they're going into this area and they are not coming out. And especially when you start realizing that that particular elements around the shimmer could be impacting them as well, you start raising the questions that this is either going to end up with all of them dead or with all of them killing each other as their minds and comprehension of reality starts to disintegrate a little bit. Now, I'll give them credit for having the primary amount of focus on Natalie Portman and her claustrophobic situation herself, the feeling that she herself could be losing her mind. But at the same time, it's also trying to intercut with the human drama that shows why she would otherwise be reconciling with that. And that has a lot to do with her relationship with her husband, Oscar Isaac, who, yeah, they sell the chemistry really well in the first act, but it gradually drops away as part of a metaphor the further you get into the movie. It tries for a sort of parallel in the third act, especially with how they confront the nexus of it all, and I'm not sure it pays off as cleanly as it could, because it becomes less about self-destruction and more about some sense of mutation, for lack of better words, and how some people are very much willing to accept that necessary mutation and change, while others will simply succumb. But at the same time, you start realizing it becomes less about that sort of mutation and more starts focusing on mirroring and a lot of that sort of visual language and metaphor. Like, you have those elements of mutation and change within DNA. Okay, I get the idea when it comes to the larger metaphor of refraction, but at the same time, then you start getting larger elements surrounding duplication or seeing something as a distorted copy as one continues. And the more I think about it, it kind of makes a certain amount of sense how the mutation could lead to ultimately you're dealing with, in some form of self-reflection, a dueling battle with yourself, which hits a very stark and very on-the-nose visual metaphor for the final act of the movie. But at the same time, the elements of recurrence that they try to bring in through a very heavy-handed metaphor, I'm not really sure that it connects. Especially, it's a visual metaphor. They keep cutting back to it to try to make a point, and I'm not sure it feels tenuous, the connection they're trying to draw there. Incidentally, when they cut back to that visual metaphor, it shows how a lot of this movie is being told in flashback. And if there's a way to utterly kill your tension, especially within the first couple of minutes of the movie, I get why it's trying to focus more on very specific elements that are drawing you into the mind of something that's a little bit more meditative. It's not trying to make this an action movie after all. But at the same time, it does kind of kill the tension. It doesn't make things quite as exciting. You know certain characters are going to die. You know certain characters are going to come out alive at the end. And ultimately how that is realized feels, well, a little slipshod, and I'm not sure it would be it's the best artistic choice going forward overall. And on the topic of artistic choices, I'm not at all wild about some of the soundtrack stuff. Yes, when it gets a little bit more ethereal, gets a little bit more weird and off-kilter, and the electronic elements and become a little bit more fluttering and distorted and warped and alien, that's cool. But some of the heavy-handed indie pop, psychedelic pop they used to illustrate some of the scenes trying for some more of that human drama, they don't fit in this movie. And on that subject of that relationship, they try to get really cute with the final minutes of this movie in a specific element calling back to that mirrored recurrence and trying for a certain element of ambiguity. And yet, the more you think about it, the less it works. I get what they were trying to do. I get the ideas that they were trying to show, that some people, when going through that reconciliation process, they never really come out the same. But at the same time, it felt like, again, that the filmmaker was trying to be a little cute. I wasn't crazy about that. But on the plus side, again, the acting is good. It fits the sort of movie that they're trying to make that is desaturated and cold and almost mechanical at certain elements. But at the same time, it often feels like a lot of the themes and tones are in place to drive the machinery of what plot there is. And I'm not sure it always comes off as cleanly or as organically as this movie would like to appear, especially conveyed through some of the more desaturated acting performances. It works when you have Natalie Portman, who is able to convey so much of the subtlety due to so much of the focus being on her, but otherwise, no, it doesn't quite connect all the way. And you know what? I know this is sounding more negative than I probably want to be, but at the same time, it is a thought-provoking movie. I like the fact that it is willing to take its time, and there truly is some spectacular visuals. If you're going to this movie for any reason, how beautifully shot it is would be one of those big reasons. And I like a lot of the action. There is a palpable sense of tension when we get to that point. And again, some of the visual metaphors and storytelling told through that lens, really striking, really potent. There's good acting. The action that we do see is pretty solid. I just think that there are some points that are clumsier than they otherwise should be, and which took me out a fair bit. But even then, hard sci-fi for me, especially when it's trying to be this philosophical, can be a bit of a hard sell when they try to ground things in the science, and the science can feel a little shaky. And that's, for me, I don't know, I'm thinking a light 7 out of 10. Definitely worth time, go to see this movie, but at the same time, don't be surprised if you walk out not getting what you expect, because this is a very different movie than how it's marketed. It's not exactly a very fun movie, but it is a thought-provoking one, and if you're in the mood for that, hell, why not? It's worth a look. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up there. I can imagine this movie will be pretty divisive, but overall I thought I was pretty good with it. It wasn't a bad film, per se, but I think it just doesn't connect as well as it thinks it does. And hey, if you want to take a look, there it is. There's the poll up there. You can tell me how wrong I am if you think otherwise. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.